Well, now our next speaker, U.S. Permanent Representative of the United Nations, is Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Ambassador Bolton is currently a Foreign and National Security Policy Senior Fellow in the American Enterprise Institute, and his op-ed articles are regularly featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Times. John Bolton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wanted to touch briefly today on the situation with Iran's nuclear weapons program, because while we quite rightly focus on the plight of the people at Camp Ashraf and focus on their larger fate in getting refugee status and getting out of Iraq and developments in Iran broadly, I think with respect to the nuclear weapons program, we could be coming to a very, very critical point. And this has to do not with political or diplomatic hype or spin or speculation. It has to do with physics. And the physics have to do with the continued progress that the regime is making toward its long-sought objective of a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. Now, it's in connection with the regime's nuclear weapons program that I first learned of the MEK. I first saw the work that they were doing, exposing to the world information about this illicit activity by the regime that violated their commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, violated their agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, violated the comments they routinely made publicly that their only purpose in pursuing nuclear-related research was for civil power purposes. And as the evidence has accumulated over the years, what I saw that was classified when I was at the State Department often had a chance to compare to what the MEK was releasing publicly. And it was really remarkable. You know, people like myself and government can talk about the threat of nuclear proliferation. It sounds very abstract. When you think about it, it's been 50 years since we've had an atmospheric nuclear test. When I speak to college students and talk about the threat of nuclear proliferation, to them, a nuclear explosion, some grainy black and white TV footage from the late 40s or 50s, it's like a different world to them. Now, I'm not suggesting we resume atmospheric testing for educational purposes, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying that the reality of nuclear threats is something that's a little bit distant from people's experience. So to have information about the regime's activities made public, I felt was very important. And I think what we're seeing right now is that this 20-year-long effort by the regime is getting perilously close to success. We've had just in the past week yet another report by the International Atomic Energy Agency based on information that the IAEA has. It's essentially public information, not based on anything we don't know about, but based on what they see publicly. There's already a sufficient stock of low-enriched uranium for the regime to fashion into 5 or more nuclear devices with a little bit more work on the enrichment process. The production of enriched uranium, which anyone who knows anything about nuclear weapons will tell you is the long pole in the tent toward developing a weaponization capability, are proceeding essentially unhindered. New generations of centrifuges, much more efficient, with much greater capacity, prepared to be introduced, and this progress of building a broad and deep nuclear infrastructure continues. And in the meantime, while this work proceeds right in front of us, the United States, as it has for 20 years, is still trying to find ways to negotiate with this regime. This is a faith that goes beyond religious faith. You can't find empirical reality that justifies the continuation of this negotiation. There just simply isn't any evidence for it. Let's just look at the current round. With great fanfare, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in Germany met with the regime's negotiators in Istanbul and had several days of negotiations, and when they finished, they came out and declared it was a great success. Much progress had been made. What was the tangible outcome? They had agreed to meet 5 weeks later in Baghdad. Well, that's pop the champagne. You know, diplomacy is the only profession on earth where success is defined as having another meeting. And where was that meeting? Baghdad, of all places. My goodness, isn't that an interesting selection? So we go to Baghdad and we hear reports that the IAEA is close to reaching agreement over access to the Parchin facility, an armor artillery missile base where the regime has undoubtedly been testing the high explosive component critical to weaponization, to taking the enriched uranium or plutonium in the pit of a nuclear weapon, compressing it into critical mass, and creating the uncontrolled chain reaction that the nuclear weapon is designed for. And negotiations at Baghdad then come after this happy news from the IAEA. Of course, there's no signed agreement. And yeah, there are still a few issues unresolved, but it's good news. You can count on that. So the negotiators come to Baghdad, and they have 2 days of negotiation. And what do they agree to? They agree to meet again. It's another success. 4 weeks later in Moscow. Except this time we find by reports in the New York Times, and you know the New York Times is always right. But the New York Times reports that there was, this is their word, a frenzy of activity at the end because they couldn't agree on the next city. And they finally compromised on Moscow. You know, maybe the 4th meeting... Maybe the 4th meeting will be in Tehran. Why not? Let's cut to the chase here, you know? What is this doing? It is, once again, buying time for the regime to make progress toward nuclear weapons. Time is not a neutral factor in diplomatic negotiations. Those negotiations are like all other forms of human activity. They have costs as well as benefits. And the cost of negotiation is the time that Iran gets to continue to move toward that objective. People talk about the effect of sanctions as having a coercive impact on Iran. What effect? The Director of National Intelligence, the Obama administration's own appointee, testified to Congress 2 months ago that all of the existing sanctions had had no effect on Iran's behavior or policy in the nuclear field. And the new sanctions we see coming into effect this summer may have an economic impact, but there's simply no evidence they've done anything to slow down the Iranian nuclear weapons program. In fact, if anything, all of the attention to the sanctions, to Stuxnet and Flame, to other covert activities against the program simply divert us from the pressing reality that they are getting closer and closer to their objective, without even knowing whether there are activities inside Iran, inside North Korea, inside Syria we don't know about. Now, I think the answer here is that this has to be coupled by a declared policy of the United States government and our friends in Europe that not only are we opposed to this regime having nuclear weapons, we are opposed to this regime, period, and it needs to be overthrown. Thank you very much.